Hello and welcome to Blood Bowl, the game of fantasy football, as they say. It's always good to hear about new people discovering what is overall my favourite game. So I wanted to make something that might be helpful to newcomers. However, you're looking to start playing the game, it can be a bit difficult to get going. If you've got the tabletop version, this Season 2 box set, you're faced with this quite thick rulebook, which can be quite daunting. Or if you're playing an online version of the game, you might be equipped only with something like Blood Bowl 2's campaign mode, which doesn't do a very effective job of teaching how the game actually works and assumes a lot of prior knowledge from the tabletop game. So the aim of this series is to explain how the game works in what's hopefully a clear and concise way. It won't replace the rulebook entirely. There'll be things that you still need to look up as you go, but it should give you a good starting point so you can get a team on the pitch and start playing and see what the options are that you'll need to go in and check the rulebook for. Plus, there'll be a layer of insight from someone who's been playing the game a long time, which will hopefully be of some benefit, dubious as it may be. But like the game itself, so it's loosely based on American football in that there are two teams fighting over a ball trying to score touchdowns. It's originally written by Jervis Johnson for Games Workshop back in the 80s, and it's set in an alternative version of the old Warhammer Fantasy setting. It's alternative in that there's less war and more football. So you get teams of humans, but also elves, dwarves, orcs, like all the sorts of things you'll find in a Tolkien-esque fantasy world. But also Warhammer-specific things like lizardmen, Skaven, or Chaos. And a few flavours of undead trope thrown in as well. The game's had a few additions, including some time in the wilderness, where Games Workshop almost sort of dropped it for a while, and the game was kept alive and fresh by a strong player community that kind of kept on running tournaments, making updates to the rules. But Games Workshop relaunched it in 2016 with a new yet very familiar rule set and a new range of miniatures. So I've been playing since not long after the release of this mid-90s edition, with a bit of a gap where I only dabbled every now and then before getting back into playing the game sort of properly and regularly in some online leagues, which all happened during the pandemic on Cyanide's Blood Bowl 2. So it's that game's like a fairly faithful recreation of the rule set that's known as Living Rulebook 6, I think. I may have the number wrong on that, but it's but one of the rule sets that was sort of player-led in developing. But late in 2020, Games Workshop released the latest and current version of the game, so known as Season 2. And this contains some of the biggest shifts in the rules we've ever had. And it's still essentially the same game, but there are some sort of subtle yet major differences. And this is the rule set that these guides are going to focus on. So if you're planning to play Blood Bowl 2 or using older tabletop rules, there will be some differences. I'll try to highlight these as we go, because the Season 2 rule set is still quite new to me as well. Like, given the pandemic, I've not had an opportunity to play that many games of it. I think three or four so far. But whether you plan to play Blood Bowl 2 on tabletop or online using Fumble or Blood Bowl 2 or Blood Bowl 3 when it's released sometime in 2022 or maybe later, who knows, you'll hopefully find this a useful place to start getting to grips with how the game works. And this won't necessarily help you to be good at the game. There's plenty of material out there for that, and I'm going to point you to some of it as we go. But this should help you get to grips with how the game works and get you coached in your first match. When you do get to the point of trying to get better at the game, the key things that Blood Bowl rewards are good strategic thinking in terms of positioning your players, the decision making behind which actions to take at what time, and that's because it's also a game that's largely it's about risk management. So how do you minimise risks, and how and when do you take bigger risks for bigger rewards? And a good understanding of probability will really help you to do that, as well as some experience about what actions are more or less risky than others. One sort of golden rule to mention, and I'm just saying this at the top because it doesn't really fit in anywhere else with what I've prepared, is that with any, and actually the phrase D6, I don't want to assume prior knowledge. So a D6, I will mention that D6 is a lot. It's just a six-sided dice numbered one to six. If you play tabletop or like war games or role-playing games, you'll be very familiar with this. But for anyone who doesn't, a D6 is just a six-sided dice. I'm also going to mention D8s every now and then. That's just an eight-sided dice. So D and a number is that many number-sided dice. But with any D6 roll you make in the game, a natural one on the dice, so it comes up a 1, that's always a failure, and a natural 6 always succeeds. And so like, even the most unlikely plays can happen at worst one time in 6, and even the best players are going to have those same odds, just like 16-17% chance of everything just going horribly wrong for what should be an easy thing. I just wanted to mention that at the top because it's something to bear in mind as we look at some of these many things we're going to look at. So Blood Bowl is played on a pitch, which so if you play it on tabletop, is a game board. We've got a digital version of it here. So here I'm using a site that's called Roll20. So it's made really for tabletop role-playing games like D&D and plenty of other things. But I have a setup here for Blood Bowl, which works quite nicely. I've not had a chance to properly test it against a real opponent yet, but it works quite nicely for Blood Bowl. I'll also probably, I haven't decided where yet, but I'll probably show some things using Blood Bowl 2, just where the visual representations might be more helpful to be able to see what's going on in a more three-dimensional way. I do have the box game, of course, but I don't really have a good setup for filming things on the board or on a tabletop, and I'm not actually that convinced that you get a very good angle on the board to make explanations very clear. So I'm just going to show things digitally where it's like easier to manipulate and label things and highlight particular areas. So we're just going to go for that. If you're playing tabletop, as well as a pitch, you need 2 teams of players, some dice. So a set of Blood Bowl dice is at least 2d6, a d8. So mention we've defined what they are. There's also a d16 that comes with the game, which is helpful, but it's not essential and you can do without it. I've never come across any other game that uses a d16, so if you don't have one that comes with it, there's not really much point seeking one out. Probably for each player, you'll need at least one set of the 3 special block dice, which are unique to Blood Bowl. They come with the game. They're also available from Games Workshop. Some third-party companies sell them as well. You can probably find a set of just block dice on eBay somewhere for pretty cheap. There are also templates that come with the game that are useful. Again, they're not essential. You can work around using them. They can be bought separately if you find the game easier to play with them. So the pitch is divided up into squares. It's a grid. And another golden rule is only one player can stand in a square at any one time. And they have to be fully in a square. So you'll never get a situation where a player's standing like that. They have to be fully inside a square. And only one player in a square at a time. They're single occupancy spaces. Yeah, that's those. Squares are also used to measure movement around the pitch, so you don't need any separate sort of measuring equipment, tape measures or anything to measure that. The only thing you do measure are passes, which uses one of the templates we mentioned. So the pitch looks like this. There's a bit of anatomy to explore in the pitch. There's an end zone along each short end of the pitch. It's supposed to be 1 square deep. I just made it bigger on here. It's just 1 square of the end zone. And you'll be trying to score a touchdown by having a player standing up and holding the ball in the end zone opposite you. That's how you score touchdowns. So if this team are trying to score here, this team are trying to score here, at the opposite end. The middle of the pitch, so these 14 squares here, 7 in each half of the pitch, it's called the line of scrimmage, and it's where the teams have first contact at the beginning of every drive. There are 4 square wide areas along each side of the pitch, going all the way along here. These are called wide zones. And when you set up your team, we'll cover this when we come to how you kick off later in the game. You have to have a minimum of 3 players along the line of scrimmage in your own half. So that forces the teams together at the beginning. And you can have a maximum of 2 players anywhere in each wide zone. So anywhere in this area, 2 players. Anywhere in this area, 2 players. For a total of 4 players on the wings, 2 on each side. Blood Bowl teams can contain up to 16 players in total, but you only have a maximum of 11 on the pitch at the start of any drive. So the real people playing Blood Bowl, you and your opponent, referred to throughout the rules as coaches. And this is to set you apart from the players, which are the players in your team. So stop thinking of yourself as someone who's playing the game, you're now coaching your team. And it's just a helpful differentiation because the players on the pitch are quite a different thing. So let's look at some player profiles. So I'm showing 2 options for 2 teams here. So humans, which are something we can probably all identify with, and undead. And I've chosen these 2 to look at because I think they're the best 2 teams for new coaches to learn how to play the game with. So not necessarily the best teams for having early success as you're learning the game. They're not like the easiest teams to use. But in terms of simplicity, all-round options, and things like that, I think these are the 2 that are easiest to learn the game with. There's an orc team as well, which historically have always been a good starter team as well for learning the game. But in the current edition, they've just had an extra layer of complication added to them, which I think just makes them it moves them out of that easy to use for beginners sort of idea. So we're left with humans and undead. I think two very solid teams to start learning how to play the game. If you've got the season 2 box set, you'll have Imperial Nobility and Black Orcs in there. They're both a bit more tricky to handle as you're learning to play the game. But if that's what you've got, then just go for it with those. But if you have options, humans and undead are great for learning how to play the game. Let's focus in on a human lineman. So this is the epitome of averageness in the game. Sort of a human lineman's not particularly good at anything, but they're also not a terrible player. The stat line that you see here for them, it's sort of considered average for Blood Bowl, like not mathematically. Like as far as I'm aware, nobody's bothered to add up all the stats in the game, then divide them by the number of different players. Like it's not like specifically a mean like that. It's just sort of like a casual median. So anything worse than this stat line is bad. Anything better is good. So MA is movement allowance. So this is the number of squares that a player can move in a turn. 6 is a decent number, and sort of further emphasise what I mean. Is anyone of MA 5 or lower, so like the ogre, halfling, the skeleton, zombies, and mummies that you see on the screen. They're all slower than movement 6, so they're considered slow players. You see as well like the human blitzers, the ghouls, they're movement 7, human catchers are movement 8. They're faster than 6, so they're considered fast players. The fastest players in the game are Skaven gutter runners at movement 9, and as of the current edition, this is now a cap on movement. You can't improve a player to better than movement 9, so movement 9 is the fastest you can get. You can go all the way down to movement 1 in theory. The slowest players in the game to start with are tree men at movement 2, and they're so slow they have special rules to do with how slow they are. The next one, ST, is strength. You use strength when you're blocking opposing players. So in a block, you compare strengths. The strongest player has an advantage on the block, so they're better at it. Most players in the game are strength 3. Human catchers and halflings are strength 2, so they're weaker. They're not as good at blocking as a human lineman. Ogres and mummies are strength 5, so they're stronger. They're better at blocking than a human lineman. AG is agility, so you use agility for avoiding other players' tackles when you move around the pitch, and for anything to do with the ball, except for actually throwing it. That uses this next stat, PA, which is passing. You notice that both of these, the agility and passing, they have a plus sign next to the number in the column there. And that means they're like a target number stat. So when you use them, you're rolling a single d6, and that's the minimum number you need to be successful. So lower is better on these. So Ag 3+ is your benchmark here on the human lineman, which means they should succeed on agility rolls 2 out of 3 times, 3+ on a dice. All the humans have Ag 3+, as well as the wights and the ghouls on the undead team. The rest of the undead have 4+ or worse in the case of the mummies. They're not on the screen, but all elf players in the game have agility 2+, which makes them they're better at that side of the game, at moving the ball around and dodging. Having a separate passing stat, that's something that's new for the current edition of the game. It was previously just an agility roll. There was no passing stat. Everything, throwing, catching, all of that was on agility. To be fair, I think throwing the ball accurately is probably a bit more difficult than catching one that's been thrown to you. So I've not really got any problem with this change. It does probably hurt elf teams the most. Like I said, they're all agility 2+. So they previously had a whole team of players that could just reliably throw a pass. But that has been taken away from them. It is an area they've been hit. But what adding the passing stat does do is increases the importance of throwers, who are always going to have a better passing stat. So the undead team doesn't have a thrower. Their best passing is 4+ on the ghoul. Yep. But undead, they're sort of more of a running team anyway. Even historically, undead haven't thrown the ball that much. They run down the pitch as a unit. That's just how they play. You notice that both the zombie and the mummy don't have a passing stat, so they've just got a dash in there instead. Any player that doesn't have a PA value is unable to attempt to throw the ball. They just can't do it. But in contrast to that, the human thrower is PA 2+, which is great. So a lot of throwers in the game, like specialised thrower players, have 2+ in this stat. But some of them are lower. Like there are some throwers in the game who are not that good. So the humans do have one of the better throwers in the game. The 4+ passing on the lineman, like the rest of their stats, is probably about average. So human throwers are exceptionally good at actually chucking the ball where it's supposed to go. The final stat here is AV. So this is armor value. And it represents how resistant a player is to injury, whether that's down to sort of how much armor they're wearing or like just how tough they are. And this also has a plus sign, so again, it's a target number, but not like agility or passing. Your opponent rolls against your armor value, so it's better to have a high number in it because it makes the roll more difficult. They're also rolling it on 2 dice added together, or 2d6. It's usually abbreviated to. Yeah, so that's the target. A target on 2 dice for them for AV. So almost all of the human team has AV 9+. That's sort of our benchmark figure, and that means the opponent has to roll 9 or higher on 2 dice to hurt the players. So catchers wear less armor to make use of their speed. That makes them a bit easier to injure on 8+. And ogres are tougher and harder to hurt on 10+. That's how AV works. We'll cover specifically how it works in a later video. One last thing to mention here, just because it's a change from earlier editions, AG and AV having target numbers is like new to the Season 2 rule set. So if you're playing an older version, it will look differently. It will look different because it was previously just a number, and then it left you having to do a bit of maths to work out what you needed to roll. Switching it around like this just takes that extra step out. It gives you a more straightforward roll. So Blood Bowl is a turn-based game, and one coach will move and act with their whole team before the other coach does the same with theirs. So this goes on for 8 turns, the first half, and then the teams go again, alternating for another 8 turns until the game ends. Sequence is only interrupted when a touchdown is scored. The team that scored will kick the ball to the other team, who continue their sequence with their next turn. You toss a coin or roll off at the beginning. The winner deciding whether they're going to kick or receive, and the receiving team takes the first turn in the first half. In the second half, the teams switch around, so both teams get the same number of turns, and in theory, they both have the same length attacking and defending drives. If you're playing on tabletop, the first thing you need to do, and we've got this represented here, is you need to move your turn counter along this special track. So in the box, if you've got the tabletop version, you'll have a dugout that looks like this. You'll have counters to move along it. And it's really important for both coaches to do this, to remember to do it, to keep track of where they are in the game. And in older editions, there were rules that would sort of punish you for forgetting to do this. And I think it's generally accepted to be a good thing that these rules have been removed. But it does sort of help to highlight how important it is to keep an accurate count of turns. So everybody knows how far through the game you are, and it properly times out to make sure things are even like that. In the current rules, there's just sort of a mutual responsibility to help each other remember to do it, which is probably a bit friendlier. And in online platforms, like definitely in Blood Bowl 2, the turns just keep count of themselves. You just have to watch which turn you're on. Also on the dugout, you have these reroll counters, which you have on tabletop as well, or a reroll tracker. And team rerolls are really sort of valuable things that allow you to reroll a dice result that you don't like. And new for the current edition is you can use as many of these as you like in a single turn, where it's always previously been capped at 1 a turn. You still though can only re-roll a single result once, so if your second roll is also bad for you, you can't re-roll it again. And this stacks with any personal re-rolls that players get with skills that they have. So there are several skills that allow you to just re-roll specific actions for the player that has the skill, but no matter the result, you can only re-roll a single action once. In your turn, you can activate and take an action with each of your players in turn. And once you've acted with the player, you can't go back to them again. So you need to do everything you're going to do with the player in one go. So the sequence is sort of activate a player, declare their action, carry out their action, end their activation, move to another player, and then you don't go back to that other player who's finished their action. There are a few different actions you can take with players, and we're going to look at all of these in detail in the series. The 2 basic actions are move and block, but there are also special actions that a team can only take one of a turn. These are pass, handoff, foul, and blitz. I don't think there are any others. I think that's the 4. Move actions can often happen without risk, but all other actions always have a chance to fail. And if you fail any of these actions, you take what's called a turnover. And as you can probably guess, that ends your team's turn. So the current player's activation ends with their failure. You can't activate any more players and play passes to your opponent. So the final thing to look at in this basics video is tackle zones. So these are fairly simple, but they're the area that leads to the most complicated parts of the game to get to grips with. And also just understanding how tackle zones works is fundamental to learning to play. So if you get tackle zones, you'll pick up the fiddliest parts of the game fine. So it's good to look at these early, get the hang of what they are. So a player's tackle zone is simply the 8 squares immediately surrounding them. So it's all of the highlighted squares next to this zombie. So the zombie, the Z token, is controlling this whole area and is going to passively attempt to interfere with any play happening in these squares. So if we stand a human lineman into this square, that human lineman is now marked by the zombie. And that's going to make it difficult for the human to do something. So any agility or passing rolls are going to be difficult for the lineman because the zombie's just going to make it harder for them to do things like catch or pick up the ball. Same is also true the other way around. The zombie is marked by the lineman as well. So in the zombie's turn, the zombie's going to, well, not even just in the zombie's turn, but the zombie has those same penalties as well. And they're marking each other because they're in each other's tackle zone. The lineman is in the zombie's tackle zone, so the zombie is marking the lineman. And that's how they go. Tackle zone penalties stack as well. So if a second zombie were to be marking the human lineman and the human lineman tried to pick up the ball, the penalty's doubled. And we're going to look more at tackle zones as we examine specific actions later. But for now, it's enough just to understand that the tackle zone is the 8 squares surrounding a player and that a player in an opponent's tackle zone is marked. Just get the hang of that, bear that in mind as we look through some other bits to this series. But that's all for this video on the basics. In part 2, we're going to start examining the different actions your players can take. And we'll begin with the simplest one, which is the move action.